This is the third part of a three-part input on digital intimacy and its discontent. You can begin here, but if you want a more chronological coherence, you can go back to part one and then eventually come to this part three, where I'm going to talk about the relationship between intimacy and labor. Because the most invisible part of the work of intimacy is labor. It sounds common sense to us that relationships and social connections require work and energy and resources. And yet, so uplifting is the promise of intimacy, the joy of proximity, the experience of closeness, that we often overlook the work that goes into making intimacy design. Melissa Gregg, in her book Work's Intimacy, details how we are made to love our work and develop an intimate relationship with the act of production and consumption, which can be both mechanical and exploitative. Focusing on the history of how made invisible in the history of factory-based production, Gregg unearths archives where women were reduced to numbers, processes, and operators who were made invisible in the making of the product. Building on Gregg's work, I would argue that one of the preconditions of intimacy is the acceptance of invisibility. Inspirational team building posters that ask us to replace the I with the we so that we become one of the boys, or even pop cultural songs like Two Becomes One, all hint at this risk, but also the frisson of intimacy, where we dissolve ourselves into a networked whole. Perhaps this intimacy takes on a more sinister tone when we shifted to the digital networks of how individuality, deviation, or resistance is made invisible in the production and engineering of intimacy. As I say this, I know that those of you who share a Star Trek fandom with me will be reminded of the Borgs, where each member is a collective, and infecting one member infects the entire collective, so that they could convert everybody into becoming one. You shall be assimilated. Resistance is futile. In thinking through the question of the invisible labor of digital intimacies, both our social media collectivity and our networked connectivity, it's necessary to remember that there are various layers of automation, algorithmic and human, that perform the work that we do not see in our seamless connectivity. I want to reference for us the work of Jennifer Light, who produced one of the foundational material histories of computation in her book called When Computers Were Women. Light reminds us that in the 40s and 50s, when computers were mainframe, the masculine role was that of the architect. In those mainframes, the size of large rooms, there were women with fresh degrees in mathematics and physics who used to be hired as computers and perform the actual task of computation, which then would be architected into batches and parallel processing units by the mainframe. The first computers in the history of computation were real-life women. They managed the hardware, performed the mathematical calculations, and became the living wetware, combination of hardware, software, and human, that made computation possible. They were an intimate part of the computer, but they became invisible in the story of computation and how it evolved as a personal device. This omission of bodies and their labor also suddenly came to the fore with the recent unleashing of the global pandemic, because in mid-March 2020, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter had to let go thousands of their content moderators and send them to home, perhaps code for being made redundant and precarious because of the lockdown and the health measures. As a result, the people who aid the artificial intelligence softwares in making decisions about the nature of content were suddenly not available to the network. In the hands of the measuring machines which cannot identify context or engage with interpretation, the users started noticing a ruthless takedown, blocking, and censorship regime where machines worked on simplified protocols that were unable to deal with the complexity of human expression. The absence of these human operators, always made invisible in the moderation labor that keeps our social media feeds bearable and manageable, suddenly brought to the fore the immense amount of social, emotional, and interpretive work that these content moderators perform behind the scaffoldings of terms of service of community management. It's very rare that these workers are recognized as supporting our social media intimacy, and their labor is often discarded as low-skilled, machinic, and disregarded as fruitful. And that's the third point I want to make for this event. To be aware that celebrating technological intimacy often forgets the fact that in those networks are human beings who are reduced to becoming automation and are often employed only to be replaced by automation that mimics their practice. The question of future of work is often posed as a question of humans being replaced by machines. While this might be true for jobs that require rote mechanization and operations, the larger question is always going to be about human beings reduced to machines. The invisible labor and the hiding of human interventions in our technological intimacies is a stark reminder of how intimacies are being packaged, produced, and consumed by those who can afford it, while people in the service of creating it are often being made to work in invisible and precarious contexts. So these are my three interventions when thinking through the idea of digital intimacy, my three discontents, if you will. That a lot of calls for opening up technologies, for positioning digital intimacy as the answer to our current physical distancing, for accepting intimacy as joyful and happy making by default. In all of those instances, we have to consider these 3 points. First, that intimacy is a demand, and it creates a gentrified, controllable subject who has to fit into the milieu that they are operating in. Think of intimacy as an installation guide, where an individual is literally being installed to be made legible to this relevant social operating system. Second, that intimacy is not about that particular moment. It's not just about that nanosecond of touch and being close, but that it is generated and framed historically. And that these histories are both technological and social and coded with politics of otherness and exclusion. And that intimacy within digital networks is a production of inequity, which is the most visible when we look at how labor gets to be made invisible in the circuits of digital connectedness and collectivity. It would be important the next time we perform the glory of digital intimacy, or call for radical openness, or talk about putting people online, to think of those who are made vulnerable, those who cannot afford to participate, and those who are historically deemed incapable and unworthy of intimacy, and how we might need more nuanced interventions in building open infrastructures and design interventions if we want to make digital intimacy inclusive, immersive, and human. Thank you.